Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans. Welcome to The Bunker. As many of you will know, this year Jehovah's Witnesses attended their 2021 Powerful by Faith convention in a socially distanced way by means of a series of pre-recorded talks and videos. A disturbing feature of this year's convention was the focus on apostates and repeated calls for Jehovah's Witnesses to ignore them and block out any criticism of the organisation. With the convention now over, I've decided to combine all of this footage into one video for posterity. We'll begin with David Splain's now infamous talk on the Saturday afternoon of the convention, titled "Put Up a Hard Fight for the Faith."
Put up a hard fight for the faith. Now, those are the words of Jude, the half-brother of Jesus. And it's important to consider them in their context. So let's do that. Please turn to Jude, verse 3. He says, "Beloved ones, although I was making every effort to write you about the salvation we hold in common, I found it necessary to write you to urge you to put up a hard fight for the faith." Now, Jude himself had been putting up a hard fight for the faith. Consider this. Just 3 years earlier, his own fleshly brother James was stoned to death at the order of High Priest Ananias. That was an open attack on God's people, and it must have been very painful to Jude and to others. But here's something interesting. Jude is not warning his brothers about High Priest Ananias or about persecution. He has something else in mind, a different type of attack, and this is a sneaky one. Let's look at verse 4, and we'll see why he wrote his letter. Notice the very first words, "My reason is." So this is what I have in mind when I'm writing you, brothers. My reason is that certain men have slipped in among you who were long ago appointed to this judgment by the Scriptures. So Jude is talking about false brothers who are presenting a real danger to the congregations, in some ways, a greater danger than outright persecution. And did you notice what Jude said about those false brothers? They had slipped in. They were sneaky. Now, that was true back then, and it's true today, as we'll see. And brothers, this is a very serious matter that we're considering today. Think of this. Was the Christian congregation brought down by persecution in the 2nd and 3rd centuries? It wasn't. It was brought down by false brothers, apostate teachings. And so the devil can use an outright attack. He can use persecution to try to batter the structure of the Christian congregation, but sometimes he uses rot from within. A subtle means to attack us. But whatever method he uses, we have to fight. Our faith is involved, and our faith is worth fighting for. It's a gift from Jehovah. We have to hold on to it. It's a product of His Holy Spirit, so we have to put up a hard fight for our faith.
So yes, it's time to talk about that talk. David Splain, governing body member, is here giving the talk, "Put Up a Hard Fight for the Faith," and by this point many of you will know all about it because of course it leaked right here on the Lloyd Evans channel 7 or 8 days before it was released on jw.org. There has been much said about the video. I'm looking at my channel page now, and the live stream where we covered this for JW Watch is on 39,000 views, having streamed 2 days ago, so tens of thousands of people have already seen the spectacle of what is essentially David Splain's apostate rant. David Splain dedicates 34 minutes of the Powerful by Faith program to ranting against apostates and the media. That's what this talk is about. When he talks about putting up a hard fight for the faith, he's talking about fighting apostates and fighting the media who are apparently hell-bent on, I don't know, the annihilation of Jehovah's Witnesses? You tell me. But it's interesting that he can't even get through his introductory comments without resorting to misrepresentation and efforts at manipulation and scaremongering. Take, for example, where he says,
Notice what Jude said about those false brothers? They had slipped in. They were sneaky. Well, that was true back then, and it's true today.
Yes, apostates are sneaky, apparently. They sneak around. They're cowards. Why don't they just come out into the light and be open about who they are? He's obviously completely overlooking the fact that everything is against someone who becomes an apostate. In other words, someone who stops believing the Jehovah's Witness religion. How can they be open? How can they walk into their kingdom hall and say, you know what, I don't think this religion's true anymore. Can we talk about this? Does anyone have any good arguments? Am I on the wrong path here? How can you do that as a Jehovah's Witness with this threat of shunning hanging over you? There's a reason why apostates are, quote, sneaky. And by the way, I don't think that's actually an accurate way of describing all apostates. I'm certainly not sneaky. I'm quite open about the fact that I'm an apostate. I know lots of people don't like the word apostate because of all of the negative connotations and stigmatization that David Splain and his colleagues attach to the word apostate. But for me, being an apostate is something that you need to do. If you find out that your religion is wrong and indeed abusive, apostate, according to the dictionary, simply means someone who leaves their religion. If you find out that your religion is false, if you genuinely believe that you've been misled by your religion, why would you want to stay in it? Of course you'd want to get out of it. But the problem is, the Jehovah's Witness religion doesn't let you get out, doesn't let you leave gracefully without crushing penalties. And that's why in some instances, yes, people do need to be sneaky, especially if they've got loved ones inside and they've woken up and realized that they're all being lied to, that everything that they've been led to believe for years or decades was a lie. They can't just walk into the kingdom hall and say, you know what, I don't believe this anymore. I'm happy to be friends with you all, but I'm peacing out here. There will be crushing penalties. So it's disingenuous in the extreme for David Splain to be characterizing apostates as sneaky, as he will do again in this talk, by the way. He also says,
and so the devil can use an outright attack. He can use persecution to try to batter the structure of the Christian congregation, but sometimes he uses rot from within.
Sometimes the devil uses rot from within. Apostates are rot. If you disagree with David Splain as a Jehovah's Witness, if you find yourself no longer being able to go along with what he's teaching, with the organization's policies, including policies that put children in harm's way, if you stop lavishing this man with the respect and adoration he craves, you are rot. Already the ad hominem is flowing. Already we're getting the insults. This is just blatant manipulation and stigmatization of anyone who disagrees with David Splain's authority.
So in this talk, we're not going to discuss persecution. We're going to discuss two of the subtle means Satan uses to weaken our faith: apostasy and negative reports about Jehovah's Witnesses in the media. So first, let's talk about apostasy, and we'll call it spiritual poison. Now think about poison. What's the best way to avoid being poisoned? Well, we have to recognize poison when we see it and then avoid it. And the same principle applies to teachings that could destroy our faith. And that's not always easy. Now, not many of our brothers and sisters would deliberately get involved with apostates, but it could happen without our realizing it. We receive letters at times from brothers and sisters who are troubled by something they saw on a web page, an accusation, a rumor about the society or about the organization. And the problem is, they had no idea that apostates were behind it. It's tricky, because the apostates don't advertise, "You are now on an apostate web page." They often pose as sincere witnesses who just have questions or concerns. And some who aren't really apostates can cause just as much trouble as the apostates do by their negative talk and criticism. Brothers, we need to be on the alert. This is serious. Suppose that, out of curiosity, you get into a discussion forum with individuals who claim to be Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, maybe they are, and maybe they aren't. You don't know. You've never met them. And someone starts asking questions. What did you think of last month's broadcast? Did you really find it encouraging? Or do you think the brothers who write Watchtower articles are living in the real world? I wonder if they realize just how hard it is out here. And then a few others join in with their own negative comments. Now, you don't know whether these individuals are apostates or just brothers and sisters who are in serious spiritual trouble. But does it matter? How does it make you feel? When you leave the forum, do you feel upbuilt? Determined to expand your ministry? More convinced than ever that Jehovah has an organization that you love and that you're delighted to be a part of. You feel honored to be a part of that organization. Or does the experience leave you sad, uneasy, uncomfortable?
And there we have a direct appeal to emotion. It doesn't matter whether it's a valid criticism of Jehovah's Witnesses. How does it make you feel? If it makes you feel uneasy, if it makes you feel dispirited about your Jehovah's Witness beliefs, then it's not worth paying any attention to. You should avoid it. In fact, it's not just that you should avoid it. You should view it as spiritual poison.
So first, let's talk about apostasy, and we'll call it spiritual poison.
So we've already had in this talk apostates referred to as sneaky. We've had apostates referred to as rot. And now we're having apostasy referred to as spiritual poison. Do you get the feeling this isn't a religion that handles criticism all that well? That's the overriding feeling I'm getting here. And hopefully I'm not alone here. Hopefully even believing Jehovah's Witnesses will be watching this thinking, what is it with this religion and its seeming inability to deal with even the slightest, mildest criticism? I mean, you think of the examples David Splain was giving there of people saying less than flattering things about JW Broadcasting or suggesting that the writers of Watchtower articles might not be fully living in the real world. These are really mild criticisms of the organization compared to what we can say about things like child abuse and blood transfusions and domestic violence. He's picking some real softballs, and apparently even this really, really mild criticism of the organization is poison, is something that people should absolutely avoid as a matter of life or death. And going back to this whole thing about apostates being really sneaky, he says,
It's tricky, because the apostates don't advertise, "You are now on an apostate webpage." They often pose as sincere witnesses who just have questions or concerns.
ladies and gentlemen, behold my book, which, as you can see, is literally titled The Reluctant Apostate in huge letters on the front. And in case you're saying, yes, but that's a book, that's not a website. Well, I have a website as well with the same title. Reluctantapostate.co is the website that accompanies this book. So how on earth I can be accused of being sneaky, of not being open about the fact that I'm an apostate? And also, if you go on YouTube, you'll quite often find that people will put XJW in the description or in the channel name when it comes to their videos. They're not suggesting when they make their videos that they are believing Jehovah's Witnesses who just have doubts. Pretty much every XJW channel I can think of is very open right out of the gate when it comes to their standing, whether they're disfellowshipped or disassociated or still inside as perhaps faders, because you sometimes get YouTubers who have to hide their identity. I just feel David Splain is openly misleading his audience here and trying to manufacture this bogeyman who doesn't really exist. I mean, apostates simply aren't sneaking around in the way he suggests. If anything, there's quite some defeatism when it comes to actual apostates when they get out, when they wake up from their Jehovah's Witness indoctrination. They kind of realize almost straight away that it's almost impossible to just wake up their friends and relatives by approaching them and saying, oh, by the way, did you know that we were all lied to? Did you know that this is a false religion? In fact, it's a cult, and I'm prepared to give you all the reasons why. They know how their friends and loved ones are going to react when they try confronting them with apostate information. So actually, in most cases, I would even argue the vast majority of cases, former Jehovah's Witnesses just sort of surrender to the idea that their friends and relatives can't be salvaged, and they go off and they do their thing. Now, when people like myself don't do that, when we do produce content, we're making it available for people when they're ready to look at it, and we're making it very clear what our position is. At least I know I am. I make it very clear in almost every video. I mean, I'm not going to just repeat the same spiel at the beginning of every video. Hello, I'm Lloyd Evans, and I'm a former Jehovah's Witness, and I identify as an apostate. But it should be clear to any Jehovah's Witness who stumbles on my channel and spends any amount of time watching my videos exactly where I'm coming from. They should be able to figure out very quickly that I'm not pretending to be a Jehovah's Witness. So I guess we're left with the question, why does David Splain need to lie? Why does he need to entirely mischaracterize apostates and mislead Jehovah's Witnesses with these sweeping generalizations about apostates sneaking around? Again, those that do sneak around have a reason to be sneaky, have a reason to stay below the radar. It's because David Splain and his colleagues have manufactured an environment in which, if they are open about their lack of beliefs, there will be crushing penalties.
Now, someone might say, I need to get involved in that forum so I can help those people. They shouldn't be together. Even if they aren't apostates, they're not good for one another. Staying in that forum to help someone is like holding his hand while he drinks poison and then having some yourself so he doesn't have to drink alone. We need to follow the advice recorded at Romans chapter 16 and verse 17. Now think of this imaginary forum that we just described in the light of Romans chapter 16 and verse 17. Now remember, there's all kinds of negative talk flying around in this forum. You don't know who's behind it. And here's what it says in Romans 16, verse 17. Now I urge you, brothers, to keep your eye on those who create divisions and causes for stumbling, contrary to the teaching that you have learned, and avoid them. Now think about that forum. Does it create divisions? Yes. Is it a cause for stumbling? Could be. Is it contrary to what we have learned? Do we even have to answer that question? Now, whether it's intended or not, the effect will be to weaken our faith. So what do we do? What does Paul tell us to do here at the end of verse 17? He says, avoid them. Now, I'd like to say a kind word to some who may be involved in discussion forums. You may like to use this medium to blow off steam, so to speak. Maybe there are little things in the congregation that are happening that you wonder about, or decisions the elders have made that you wonder about, and so you get involved in the forum and you blow off steam, and after that you feel better. But what about others in the forum? How do they feel? Wouldn't you feel awful if negative comments you made were responsible for someone leaving the truth? I know you wouldn't want that to happen. So please, please, be careful about what you say. Now, another person might say, well, I can see where those warnings about apostates apply to so-and-so. He's weak, but don't worry about me. I'm spiritually strong. I can handle it. That's like a weightlifter, thinking that he can drink a vial of poison and it won't hurt him because he's so big and strong. We are not so strong, so spiritual, so intelligent, that we can't be affected by the poison of apostate ideas.
There we go again with the insults. Apostates are poisonous. Apostates are rot. Apparently David Splain can't make his arguments without resorting to ad hominem and slurs. But it seems he's really terrified of this idea of JW discussion forums. In my experience, they do seem to be a thing. I'm thinking of one forum in particular, JW Talk, which is heavily pro-Jehovah's Witnesses. If you try and do what he's suggesting here and speak negatively against the organization, the mods are going to throw you off pretty quickly. They're kind of paranoid, as far as I know, when it comes to making sure that everyone on the forum is a Jehovah's Witness. But it seems that David Splain, because he is a power-crazed narcissist, just can't handle the idea of there being any environment beyond his control where people can talk about him or his colleagues. He just wants to be able to control everything, doesn't he? So he's terrified of even forums that are pro-JW, because how can he exert any influence there? He wants them to disband. He wants the only forums or the only environments for talking about Jehovah's Witnesses, for talking about the governing body and what they're doing, to be somehow controllable by him, somehow within his sphere of influence. And this, for me, speaks to the narcissism and arrogance of this man. I also find it interesting where he dismisses the idea of someone challenging an apostate idea because they're spiritually strong. He says,
now, another person might say, well, I can see where those warnings about apostates apply to so-and-so. He's weak, but don't worry about me. I'm spiritually strong. I can handle it. That's like a weightlifter, thinking that he can drink a vial of poison and it won't hurt him because he's so big and strong. We are not so strong, so spiritual, so intelligent, that we can't be affected by the poison of apostate ideas.
If you think about it, this is a perfect example of cult-like black and white thinking. We're not talking about vials of poison, David Splain. We're talking about ideas. We're talking about genuine concerns. We're talking about arguments against your authority. And according to what you've just said there, everything's poison if it's not lavishing you with praise and respect. It's poison if it's a criticism of the organization, even if it's a valid criticism. What does it say about this organization if they are so terrified of even the slightest murmuring, even the slightest negative talk against the leadership, that they're likening it to something that can literally kill you? I don't accept that analogy. The analogy does not hold. You will not be killed purely because you are listening to what someone's argument is against your religion. If you're just going to block out any negative talk against your religion, what does that say about the strength of your faith? Does it not indicate that your faith is incredibly fragile and can be destroyed if you subject it to the mildest scrutiny? And isn't it hypocritical coming from an organization that literally goes round telling people you need to leave your religion and join ours? And by the way, here are all our criticisms against your religious beliefs. So they're expecting everyone they meet in the ministry to criticize and apply scrutiny to their religious beliefs. But when it comes to Jehovah's Witnesses, they can't allow even the slightest scrutiny, even the slightest criticism, because apparently this would be like drinking poison.
Now, when might we feel pressured to read something that the apostates have written? Consider this scenario. The unbelieving husband of your Bible student sends his wife a link to an apostate web page and says, "Here, you better look at this and see what you're getting into." Well, your student is concerned, and she wants you to take a look and tell her what you think. Well, that's not an option. Paul says, avoid them. That doesn't mean reading apostate literature or searching social media to see what they're saying about us. So what do you say to your student? You might say something like this. I can imagine that this is very upsetting for you, and you certainly do need to know what you're getting into. I have a suggestion. We have nothing to hide. When you're at the meetings, listen carefully to what the brothers are saying. Watch how we interact with one another. Take note of how the organization is financed. Get to know the elders, their wives. Introduce yourself to the circuit overseer and his wife when they come. Visit world headquarters of the branch. I'll come with you. I'll help you. And I want you to get really acquainted with the organization. And if you do, I'm sure you'll soon realize that what the people are saying about us isn't true. Well, maybe you can think of a better answer, but you get the idea.
I can think of a better answer, David Splain. My answer would be, let's look at what the arguments are against my religion, because I know that my religion is God's one and only true religion on earth. I wouldn't be trying to persuade you to join if I wasn't 100% confident that I have the truth. If I have the truth, it should stand up to whatever arguments are leveled against it. So yes, I'll gladly look at that email. I'll gladly click on that link. I'll gladly look at whatever arguments are being leveled against my religion, because I know that they must be wrong, and I'm willing to prove to you that they're wrong. I think that's a far more satisfying and honest answer than what David Splain's suggesting, which amounts to just stick your head in the sand. I love the bit at the end there where he says,
I'm sure you'll soon realize that what the people are saying about us isn't true.
I'm sure you'll soon realize that what the people are saying about us isn't true. How can you be sure that they'll reach that realization if you're not even listening to what the people are saying about Jehovah's Witnesses? It makes no sense whatsoever. You're just giving a blanket dismissal and saying, oh, whatever it is, it must just be a lie. And I'm sure that I can prove to you that this specific argument, which I can't be bothered looking at, must be wrong if you'll only come to the Kingdom Hall and, what was it?
When you're at the meetings, listen carefully to what the brothers are saying. Watch how we interact with one another. Take note of how the organization is financed.
Take note of how the organization is financed? What does that have to do with anything? And furthermore, no one knows how the organization is financed because there's no transparency. When was the last time this organization told us how much money they have? How much money they're bringing in? How much money they're spending on settling child abuse lawsuits, which we'll get to in this video, by the way. There's zero transparency. Is he talking about where they read the congregation accounts and say how much money was spent on gas or electricity or on toilet paper? How is that sort of information going to refute or debunk an apostate argument that's being sent in an email? What does that have to do with anything? It's a deeply unsatisfying answer, but it's the only answer David Splain can come up with because he's a power-mad narcissist who just doesn't want his followers to listen to anything that in any way criticizes his organization.
Just a few drops of poison in a drink are enough to cause serious harm. And apostates often mix a few truths with lies. Do you remember Eliphaz, one of Job's false comforters? Some of what he said was true. Let's turn to Job chapter 5 and verse 13. He catches the wise in their own cunning, so that the plans of the shrewd are thwarted. He catches the wise in their own cunning. Does that sound familiar? Why, yes. The Apostle Paul said the very same thing at 1 Corinthians 3:19. In fact, in the marginal reference, we see in the little a in the middle there, 1 Corinthians 3:19. Paul may even have been quoting Eliphaz. So that was the truth. But how did Jehovah feel about Eliphaz's argument overall? Let's turn to Job 42, verse 7, and see how Jehovah felt about it. After Jehovah had spoken these words to Job, Jehovah said to Eliphaz the Temanite, "My anger burns against you and your two companions, for you have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has." A few grains of truth were mixed in with falsehoods. And at least some of what Eliphaz said was inspired by the demons. How do we know that? He admitted it. Notice Job 4, verses 15 through 17. Eliphaz says, "A spirit passed over my face. The hair of my flesh bristled. It then stood still. But I did not recognize its appearance." Let's stop there for a second. I did not recognize its appearance. So he didn't know whom he was talking to, just like someone in a discussion forum may not know whom he is talking to. Let's continue. He says, "A form was in front of my eyes. There was a calm. And then I heard a voice. Can a mortal man be more righteous than God? Can a man be cleaner than his own maker?" Does it surprise you that a demon will get involved in the debate between Job and the false comforters? It shouldn't. This was no small debate. It was a big issue. Satan had challenged Jehovah in the presence of all the angels that no man would keep his integrity under test. That demon was using Eliphaz to demoralize Job and weaken his faith. This was something that Job had to fight for, and Job fought back.
When I was initially doing my prep for this rebuttal, I was debating leaving out this entire stuff about Job, which I consider to be quite tedious and not as interesting as essentially the rest of the talk. It is, after all, a 34-minute talk, and I wanted to basically save as much time as possible and spare you as much as possible anything in this talk that might be a bit tedious. But after discussing this part of the talk in the JW Watch episode with my colleagues, again, the episode's gone on to accumulate tens of thousands of views, I now see this part of the talk as, in many ways, just as interesting as the rest of the talk. He's appealing to the story of Job as an example of why it's important to completely block out whatever claims, whatever arguments apostates are coming up with. He's saying, just as Eliphaz, one of Job's comforters, was saying things that were mostly true but with some lies mixed in, apostates can do the exact same thing.
Just a few drops of poison in a drink are enough to cause serious harm. And apostates often mix a few truths with lies.
Apostates often mix a few truths with lies. That is a sweeping statement. It's a generalization. If you're going to make that sort of claim, what you really need to do is give an example. And yet, nowhere in this talk, despite him devoting 34 minutes to talking about apostates and the media, nowhere does he give an actual argument against the organization. And isn't that telling? The fact that he refuses to give any examples at all, even in this instance, where he's saying, well, apostates mix in lies with truths. Well, if that's the case, there should be any number of examples for him to draw upon where he can say, look, this apostate, for example, says this, and notice this lie. I'm now going to prove to you that it's a lie as just one example of how they're doing this. Imagine how compelling that would be. Of course, he could cherry pick just one example and use that disingenuously to infer that everything that apostates say are similarly laced with lies, but at least it would be one example. David Splain is such a coward and such a charlatan that he can't even come up with one example of apostates lying. Meanwhile, here on my channel, I am routinely uncovering examples of this organization lying to its followers. I've even produced a video on theocratic warfare, thumbnail will appear here if Tibor is gracious, showing 4 examples of Watchtower representatives lying on video. This is an organization that says it's okay to lie sometimes because the ends justify the means. This is war. We're in a war against Satan, and sometimes in war, you've got to loosen up a little bit with your morals. Sometimes you've got to tell a few porcupines. That's the sort of organization we're dealing with. And they have the gall to point to apostates and say that apostates are the ones who are lying. Again, without showing a single example. Then we have the irony of David Splain pointing to a Bible example of a worshipper of God being tested in a talk where he's essentially telling Jehovah's Witnesses that they shouldn't allow their faith to be tested. Think about what that whole Job story was about. As David Splain himself says,
this was no small debate. It was a big issue. Satan had challenged Jehovah in the presence of all the angels that no man would keep his integrity under test.
No man would keep his integrity under test. The whole point, apparently, of Job's comforters was that they were testing Job. Job went through that test and he prevailed. And yet David Splain is invoking Job in arguing that Jehovah's Witnesses are too fragile to ever be tested. In other words, if David Splain's logic were applied to Job, there wouldn't have been a story, there wouldn't have been any comforters. Job would have sat through the whole thing with his hands over his ears just going, la, 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 I can't hear you. Wouldn't have made for a very good story, would it? How ironic, if you think about it, that even the Bible verse that David Splain is cherry-picking in support of his arguments doesn't really support his arguments because it's telling the story of someone who is willing to listen to claims against his faith. Someone who is willing to listen to negative talk. Someone who is willing to sift truth from lies, to entertain a claim and decide for himself whether it's true or not, and decide for himself to what extent it will impact his faith. That's what the whole story of Job is about, and David Splain apparently misses this irony entirely.
Apostates are more active in some places than they are in others. So if there's a lot of apostate activity in your area, people in the territory may be listening and they may challenge you when you meet them in the ministry. So how should you handle it? Don't try to argue with the apostates. Don't read their comments. Ask the elders or other experienced publishers for suggestions on how to answer the householders. Well, how poisonous are apostate teachings? Let's find out as we watch the following video.
When I was in my 40s, I was divorced. I had 3 younger kids at home. I was working 3 jobs, and I had drifted away from the congregation. I had an acquaintance who was telling me that I was in a cult and that I needed to look at some information that he had.
When I was about 30 years old, a fellow employee saw that I was one of Jehovah's Witnesses and was trying to access jw.org. He told me about someone he knew in another country who could prove to me that Jehovah's Witnesses didn't have the truth. That made me curious, and little by little I was persuaded to look at apostate material.
So I was born and raised in the truth, chose to dedicate myself to Jehovah at the age of 16. But I began to associate with people who had either formerly been associated with the truth or were very loosely associated with Jehovah and his organization. And that's really where the apostasy began to take root.
As I was reading this literature, I saw through it to an extent. But when you're drifting away, you're looking for a reason not to believe.
I began to feed my mind with different philosophies, different ideas, even studied different religions. And, you know, I told myself that I was doing that academically, but it started to influence the way that I thought and felt about things. Eventually, the elders reached out to me. I was very combative with those brothers. I even made the accusation that Noah's Ark was a fairy tale, that was part of mythology.
Oh no, imagine saying that the story of Noah is mythology. Imagine taking the mainstream view of scholars, of historians, of geologists in suggesting that there never was a global flood where even the top of Everest was submerged. Imagine suggesting it's impossible for 6.5 million species of land-dwelling animal to be crammed into a wooden box so that these animals can survive and repopulate the earth. What was this man thinking in suggesting that this story is a myth? So obviously we're here getting 3 testimonials from people, from Jehovah's Witnesses who've apparently dabbled in apostasy. As I said in the JW Watch live stream, I try very hard not to be guilty of what's called the no true Scotsman fallacy, because what's essentially being presented here are examples of apostates or people who, again, dabbled in apostasy, but were retrieved. And if I were to appeal to the straw man fallacy, I would say something like, well, they weren't really apostates because they only went so far in their research. They didn't see the information that totally debunks Jehovah's Witness beliefs. They didn't see the most damning arguments against the religion. So these aren't true apostates that are being depicted. I'm not going to make that argument. All I will say is that it's obviously easy when you've been raised in the Jehovah's Witness religion with its extremely potent indoctrination to hold on to your indoctrination despite having information shown to you that debunks your beliefs. Doing the research is a long process and a soul-searching process, and something where you really have to leave no stone unturned and pursue answers, all the while sort of fearing annihilation in case you're getting it wrong, in case you're falling for satanic lies. And what we're seeing here seems to me to be a case of people with pre-existing indoctrination into the Jehovah's Witness faith that they never really shake off. So I can't help but be a little bit skeptical, even though, again, I'm trying not to fall back on the no true Scotsman fallacy. I can't help but be a little bit skeptical as to just how much apostate information these people were subjected to, especially when they're not giving us any examples. The only example we've heard in just these opening minutes is this thing about Noah's flood, and the fact that this guy dared to suggest to the elders that it's a myth, which it is. We're not hearing anything about child sex abuse cover-ups. We're not hearing anything about human rights and shunning. We're not hearing anything about blood transfusions. We're not hearing anything about Ray Franz or Mexico Malawi. There are no examples to go off. So I think it's reasonable to suggest that these aren't really very good examples. Or put another way, if the organization wanted to make a video like this, it would find no shortage of examples of Jehovah's Witnesses who dabbled a little bit in apostate websites, in apostate videos or discussion forums, or having conversations with work colleagues along apostate lines, but whose indoctrination won through, because it is incredibly potent indoctrination. You don't just shake it off after a couple of minutes on an apostate website or after a couple of minutes of reading apostate literature, which brings me to this story of Betty Sullivan. I found it interesting where Betty said,
As I was reading this literature, I saw through it to an extent. But when you're drifting away, you're looking for a reason not to believe.
When you're drifting away, you're looking for a reason not to believe. I think there's some truth in that, but I also think the opposite is true, that if you're in the Jehovah's Witness religion and you're plagued with doubts and cognitive dissonance, you could go to a meeting, or you could go to, in this case, the Powerful by Faith convention, looking for reasons to believe in your religion. So in other words, it swings both ways. I agree that for some people, they may start deviating from the Jehovah's Witness religion over something that has nothing to do at all with child abuse cover-ups, or with shunning, or with blood transfusions, or with Raymond Franz. It could be something as relatively trivial as an elder upsetting them in some way, and they start to look for reasons to walk away from the whole thing, perhaps because they're just exhausted. Now, there are far better reasons to get out of the Jehovah's Witness religion than simply being exhausted at how frenetic it is, at how your life is micromanaged, at all the pressure to continually give of yourself. There are far better reasons, namely the fact that the religion fundamentally isn't true and is in fact even abusive. But I take that point that to begin with, you could just be looking for reasons to not believe. I just think it's fairly obvious that the same applies on the other side. If you're a Jehovah's Witness and you do have doubts, and you're starting to see that this isn't what it appears, you're starting to be concerned about the levels of control and the pressure that you're under, you could be going to events like the Powerful by Faith convention determined to find reasons to stay faithful, even though they may be bad reasons.
Those apostate doubts that I was reading kept going deeper and deeper into my heart. I stopped reading the publications. I stopped going to the meetings. And as a result, my spiritual routine was dead. So I thought I'd try to find truth elsewhere, and I looked for something out there that was in accord with what I knew the Bible taught. But I couldn't find anything.
Well, one Sunday morning, I rode by the Kingdom Hall, and I said to myself, oh, they're all in there waiting for Armageddon. Immediately, when I thought that thought, I said to myself, well, at least they feel good about themselves. How do you feel? And the answer was, I felt terrible.
Eventually, skillful use of the scriptures and just reasoning with me, the elders, it got me to realize that I had been carried off, or that I had been taken captive by human philosophy, by the deceptions and this empty reasoning of men.
I actually said a prayer. I supplicated Jehovah that he would really show me the way to the truth. And he took away this feeling of emptiness, spiritually speaking.
I realized that relationship with Jehovah, that's our most precious possession. I had to get back.
I started to study the Bible with sincerity. I wanted it to affect my mind and my heart, and I wanted it to affect change in my behavior. Now, as I did that, I felt Jehovah blessing those efforts. He began to help me to rebuild that relationship with him.
So I began to use Jehovah's name. Speaking about Jehovah became a wonderful joy and a great pleasure to me. And the result was that my ministry was very productive. And it's an amazing joy to be able to help someone come to love Jehovah.
I was just so happy to be back under Jehovah's wings and have that peace of mind. How loving Jehovah is. He wants to help us. And what better helper could we have? He's the best in the universe.
Well, if you say so, Betty. But that's the end. That's it. That's the video that David Splain is showing in his 34-minute talk about apostates and the media. We've there been introduced to 3 different people, 3 different stories, supposedly showing how poisonous apostate ideas are, even though we haven't actually heard any apostate ideas or any apostate arguments. We've just heard that thing about Noah's flood. In the entire talk, all we've heard as a possible example of a criticism against the organization or its teachings or beliefs is the Noah's flood thing, and what David Splain was saying earlier about hypothetically someone criticizing a JW Broadcasting episode or suggesting that the writers of the Watchtower magazines are out of touch. That's all we've heard so far in this talk. And here we have 3 people who are sharing their stories on camera. And interestingly, David Splain doesn't have a thing to say about these stories. I mean, you watch the video unedited, you'll see that these testimonials end and David Splain just barrels right on with his talk without mentioning anything about the stories, which is quite a departure from how these talks traditionally go. As we've seen in this convention, usually when you have a video shown, the speaker will say, "Did you notice?" and bring out some point from what was just seen by the audience in the video. David Splain isn't apparently that interested in these people or their stories. He's on a mission, and that mission is to terrify Jehovah's Witnesses into avoiding any criticisms of his organization or his authority. But even if he's not interested in talking about these stories and testimonials, I am. And I found it interesting where one of those chaps said,
So I thought I'd try to find truth elsewhere, and I looked for something out there that was in accord with what I knew the Bible taught. But I couldn't find anything.
I looked for something out there that was in accord with what I knew the Bible taught. This kind of supports what I was saying earlier about these people not really being representative of apostates or people who are truly immersed in apostate claims and arguments and evidence against the organization. He's looking for a religion that teaches what Jehovah's Witnesses teach while not being the Jehovah's Witness religion. He's falling back on his indoctrination. He's saying, okay, Jehovah's Witnesses can't be true, but maybe there's another organization that uses Jehovah's name, is preaching all over the world, and fulfilling all of these other criteria that I've been indoctrinated since childhood into thinking a religion must meet in order to be considered God's one true religion. So was it really a fair test if he was just presupposing his indoctrination, the beliefs that he was indoctrinated with, to be true beliefs? Was he even really an apostate? I would argue that manifestly this was someone who couldn't shake free from their Jehovah's Witness beliefs. Yes, he may have dabbled a little bit in science, in a little bit of critical thinking, but ultimately, if he's not willing to do the legwork, if he's not willing to exert genuine effort, genuine sincere effort in scrutinizing his beliefs objectively, of course he's just going to fall back on his indoctrination. I also found that part interesting where apparently we're led to believe that elders have some amazing apostate-proof powers and are able to skillfully use the Bible to overturn apostate ideas.
Eventually, skillful use of the scriptures and just reasoning with me, the elders, it got me to realize that I had been carried off, or that I had been taken captive by human philosophy, by the deceptions and this empty reasoning of men.
This part for me is disingenuous in how it's used. We're getting the message here that, again, elders have these special anti-apostate powers. And if you go to elders with the claims and arguments of apostates, they'll be able to skillfully leaf through their Bibles and overturn anything that's put to them. I mean, you can try that if you like. I would suggest that elders are completely clueless when it comes to the real arguments that apostates have against the organization. Again, I suppose if you're holding a candle to Jehovah's Witness beliefs and you want elders to persuade you, you're going to find a reason to find their thoughts and their reasonings persuasive. But ultimately, I hate to break it to you folks, elders are pretty clueless on most of the arguments that apostates make. And I say this as someone who used to be an elder. Indeed, I went through the ministerial training school. I was a servant for goodness knows how many years. I think 10 years. And then I was an elder for a year. And during the time that I was an elder, I was completely clueless regarding the Mexico-Malawi scandal, the UN NGO scandal, the child abuse cover-up. There were loads of things that I didn't have a clue about. It may sound weird, but I know the Jehovah's Witness religion better now that I'm out of it than I did when I was an elder. If, as an elder, someone had come to me with the actual apostate claims and arguments, none of which we're hearing in this talk, I would have been completely stumped. I wouldn't have had a clue where to begin. I'm sure I would have tried to mount some kind of rebuttal to in some way defend my beliefs, but I really would have been very ill-equipped to deal with apostate arguments, especially falling back solely on the Bible. Because as I've routinely argued on this channel, as an atheist, as someone who actually no longer considers the Bible to be God's infallible word, it turns out that the Bible itself refutes many Jehovah's Witness beliefs. Or put another way, lots of Jehovah's Witness beliefs don't actually have any basis in the Bible. It's just that Bible verses are twisted and shoehorned into supporting a pre-existing narrative that the organization wants to sell.
Now, let's consider the second challenge we face: negative reports about Jehovah's Witnesses in the media. Now, here's a good principle to follow. Proverbs 14 and verse 15. It says, "The naive person believes every word, but the shrewd one ponders each step." Some people believe everything they read in the newspaper or see on TV. Do you? Should you? Consider this. Now, you're working from door to door, and you meet a householder who says, "You Jehovah's Witnesses are terrible people. You let your children die. You don't accept medical treatment." Well, you ask the householder, "Do you know any of Jehovah's Witnesses personally?" "No." "Then where did you get the idea that we let our children die and don't accept medical treatment?" The householder says, "I have it on good authority. I read it in the newspaper." Well, if it's in the newspaper, it must be true, right? Not necessarily. Remember this: reporters have a deadline to meet, and a reporter may not have the time or the inclination to check the facts. Or the reporter may have written a balanced article, but then the editor changes it. Maybe the editor doesn't like Jehovah's Witnesses, or he's been misinformed about us. Now, it's bad enough if people in the world believe everything they read in the newspaper, but brothers, let's not be among them. Let's not be naive. Let's consider things carefully. Similarly, sometimes there's a TV program about Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, a few of these programs are balanced and fair. Many, or I dare say most, are not. And when they're not, you'll often find that the producers started out with a negative view of Jehovah's Witnesses, and then they looked for information to support their prejudice. So, whom did they turn to? Apostates and the clergy. From them, they got suggestions for people to interview, and we know what those people would say. At the very last minute, they may ask the brothers for comment just to give an appearance of fairness, but the program wasn't designed to be fair. It was designed to be unfair. It was slanted against Jehovah's Witnesses.
This is just the David Splain version of Donald Trump jumping up and down crying fake news, isn't it? Apparently, if there's anything negative in the media, if there's any show, any documentary, any news piece that has anything negative to say about the organization or presents Jehovah's Witnesses in a remotely negative light, ignore it. It must be fake. It's only going to be truthful, conveniently for David, if it portrays Jehovah's Witnesses in a favorable light. Well, why don't you give us some examples, David? Why don't you give us an example of a show, of a documentary that is fake news or that does say things about Jehovah's Witnesses that are untrue in your opinion, and let's be the judge ourselves as to whether your claims are valid. Why don't you dignify Jehovah's Witnesses with figuring this out for themselves instead of talking down to them in this incredibly patronizing way, suggesting that Jehovah's Witnesses aren't capable of sorting fact from fiction?
Some people believe everything they read in the newspaper or see on TV. Do you? Should you? Now, it's bad enough if people in the world believe everything they read in the newspaper, but brothers, let's not be among them. Let's not be naive.
It's ironic, if you think about it, that this is exactly the sort of gullibility that David Splain and his colleagues want Jehovah's Witnesses to have whenever they're reading Jehovah's Witness publications. If a Jehovah's Witness is on jw.org, or watching a JW Broadcasting episode, or reading a Watchtower magazine, they are to unquestioningly believe anything that's said to them. They are to take as fact anything that's said. Apparently, it's only when they're reading the newspaper, or only when they're watching the news, or only when they're watching a documentary about Jehovah's Witnesses that they get to start using critical thinking skills, that they need to be suspicious as to whether the information is accurate or not. And honestly, we're seeing evidence in this very talk that there is reasonable basis for suspicion when it comes to Jehovah's Witnesses reviewing the information given to them by their leaders. David Splain here is giving a bad argument, or is raising an argument against Jehovah's Witnesses that's actually valid, and spinning it as though it's somehow a lie.
Now, you're working from door to door, and you meet a householder who says, "You Jehovah's Witnesses are terrible people. You let your children die. You don't accept medical treatment." Well, you ask the householder, "Do you know any of Jehovah's Witnesses personally?" "No." "Then where did you get the idea that we let our children die and don't accept medical treatment?"
If you're a Jehovah's Witness watching this, I have to ask you the question, is it not a valid argument you let your children die? Of course it is. Obviously, we're talking here about blood transfusions. And if a Jehovah's Witness child needs a blood transfusion, or else they're going to die, Jehovah's Witness parents are expected to let them die unless the courts intervene. We even had, not so long ago, the story of Jared Scepter on a JW Broadcasting episode. I made a video about it. A thumbnail will be here if Tibor is gracious. Jehovah's Witnesses know that this is how it works. If you are a child of Jehovah's Witness parents, you will be expected to die, to martyr yourself, if a blood transfusion is the only way of saving your life. That's, in essence, what this argument is. And yet David Splain is presenting it as though it's misleading, as though it's in some way a false argument. Same thing with you don't accept medical treatment. Clearly this is talking about blood transfusions. So if you were a Jehovah's Witness and you were confronted with this argument, you'd know that this is what the householder is talking about. You'd know that they're talking about blood transfusions, and that when it comes to letting children die, that is true. And when it comes to refusing medicine, if that medicine is a blood transfusion, that is also true. What's happening here is David Splain is constructing a straw man argument where certain words are left out, and the argument against Jehovah's Witnesses is made to sound more sensationalist, slightly more sensationalist than the truth of the matter. And having constructed this exaggerated scenario, he's essentially turning around to Jehovah's Witnesses and laying the blame on apostates and the media, even though the basis of the argument, even though it was poorly worded, the basis of the argument is valid. And he doesn't even try to address that argument. He doesn't even try to explain why it's right that Jehovah's Witness parents, like the parents of Jared Scepter, let their children die. He doesn't even try to explain how it can be that Jehovah's Witnesses should be pressured to refuse certain types of medical treatment to the point where you can be disassociated as one of Jehovah's Witnesses if you willfully and unrepentantly, I'm quoting from the Shepherd book, by the way, if you willfully and unrepentantly accept a blood transfusion. There's a penalty attached to accepting some forms of medical treatment. So what he's doing, in a nutshell, is manipulating his audience, is frankly lying to his audience in just the same slimy way that we're supposed to believe apostates go around misleading people.
Now, let's be clear. Some news organizations are very conscientious about their reporting, and they want to present both sides of an issue. And when Jehovah's Witnesses are concerned, they do so at their cost. If a newspaper publishes anything positive about us, the churches will push back. Our parishioners are upset. They subscribe to your newspaper, and they don't like reading favorable things about Jehovah's Witnesses. The message? If it ever happens again, you're going to lose subscribers. Now, this matter of Jehovah's people being the subject of malicious reports isn't new. Think about the days of Queen Esther. Wicked Haman brings a bad report to King Ahasuerus. The Jews don't obey our laws. They're a danger to society. Does Ahasuerus check the facts? Does he demand proof? No. Ahasuerus is naive. He allows himself to be taken in by Haman. Well, there are a lot of modern-day Hamans today, and they use similar tactics. As a result, some government officials are taken in. They believe the slanderous accusations of the apostates. Now, if they just take the time to check the facts, they'd see that they're being lied to, but they don't check the facts. Now, again, it's bad enough, brothers, when government officials are taken in by false reports. Don't you be taken in. Have you ever heard the expression trial by media? It works like this. Someone's charged with a crime, and the case is widely publicized in the media, and the media present the case in such a way that everyone who hears about it thinks the man is guilty. Now, of course, to avoid a lawsuit for slander or libel, these media reports are very carefully worded. And we need to understand what the wording means. Here's a good principle to keep in mind. Job chapter 12 and verse 11. Does not the ear test out words as the tongue tastes food? Does not the ear test out words? What does that mean? Does it mean that if we learn that apostates are going to be featured on a TV program, we should watch it to see if what they say is true? No. It basically means to consider the source of the words. If they are the words of apostates, why would we believe them? Now think of it this way. You have a bottle on your shelf that's marked poison. Do you need to open it up, take a swig, to see if it really is poison? Believe what the label says.
This is just extraordinary. There's frankly too much to talk about here. Where do you even begin? Actually, while it's still fresh in our minds, let's talk about this verse in Job 12, verse 11, which David Splain reads, which says,
Does not the ear test out words as the tongue tastes food?
Does not the ear test out words as the tongue tastes food? He's literally reading a verse that says, how are you going to test out the words unless you hear them? That's what I'm taking away from this verse. But he then goes on to apply the scripture to say something completely different that isn't in the text.
Does it mean that if we learn that apostates are going to be featured on a TV program, we should watch it to see if what they say is true? No. It basically means to consider the source of the words.
It doesn't say anything in that verse about the source of the words. It simply talks about testing out the words. And how can you test out the words if you don't know what the words are? Again, putting words in the mouths of the Bible writers. This is a man who apparently thinks that the Bible is God's inspired, infallible word. Well, if he really believes that, why is he literally changing the text? Why is he reading something that has a very clear meaning and application and then immediately twisting it to say something that it simply doesn't say? And as to this stuff about hearing both sides of the issue, I mean, really, he says,
some news organizations are very conscientious about their reporting, and they want to present both sides of an issue. And when Jehovah's Witnesses are concerned, they do so at their cost.
My question would be, David, do you report both sides of the issue? Do you, in your propaganda, say, of course, here's an argument against what we're saying? Or do you actually go to great lengths to stop Jehovah's Witnesses from seeing the other side of the issue? How can David Splain, how can the governing body sneer at news organizations for, in their view, not fully exploring both sides of the issue when they are literally producing a 34-minute talk that emphatically tells Jehovah's Witnesses, under no circumstances look at the other side of the issue. Under no circumstances scrutinize your beliefs in any way or listen to what apostates have to say. We then have this stuff about government officials, which I can only assume is some kind of desperate lashing out at the Australian Royal Commission.
Some government officials are taken in. They believe the slanderous accusations of the apostates. Now, if they just take the time to check the facts, they'd see that they're being lied to, but they don't check the facts.
What facts? What government officials? What slanderous accusations? You're not giving us any examples. You're not dignifying your audience by telling them what the hell you're talking about. You're just telling them, oh, government officials are being lied to. Well, that's a huge claim. And if you're going to make that claim and expect your audience to take it seriously, dignify them as adults and tell them what you're talking about specifically. If you're just going to make these vague, sweeping claims about government officials falling for what apostates are saying, how can you possibly expect to be taken seriously? Again, this is nothing more than fear-mongering, stoking paranoia, and overt manipulation.
Now, for the purpose of this discussion, let's consider another way we can test out words, and that is to pay attention to what the words mean. Remember, we talked about media reports and how these are very often carefully worded to avoid a lawsuit. So suppose a report indicates that someone has been charged with a crime or that he's being investigated. All right, you have two words, charged and investigated. It doesn't mean he's guilty. Or suppose that someone is convicted and put in jail. Well, that would apply to our young brothers in Korea, wouldn't it? They were convicted and jailed. And what was their crime? They refused to kill someone. Did they do anything wrong? Or someone is found guilty by men, as Jesus was. It doesn't mean that he's guilty in the sight of God. So, brothers, we really have to think about these things. We may read that a person or an organization was sued and then settled out of court. Does settling out of court mean that they were guilty? Not necessarily. Now, in this country and others, court cases are often handled by a jury. Now, who are on the jury? Ordinary citizens with no legal training. But not only that, these ordinary citizens don't always have access to all the facts because the judge and lawyers decide which facts will be shared with the jury. So it's unlikely that the whole truth will ever come out in court. Actually, neither side probably wants the whole truth to come out in court. Now, sometimes attorneys deliberately withhold information that would be prejudicial to their clients. And in addition, the juries have prejudices like everyone else, and some of them just can't set their prejudices aside.
What we've just heard is arguably the most damning video material featuring a governing body member maybe ever. This is disgusting rhetoric. Again, I hardly know where to begin, but what I will do is something that's drastically different from what David Splain is doing. I'm going to dignify my audience, and rather than speaking to them like children, rather than speaking in vague terms and just expecting my audience to play some game of guess what's on my mind, which is what David Splain always seems to do, I'm going to dignify my audience and just say it like it is. This man is speaking about child sexual abuse lawsuits. That's what he's talking about. And nowhere is he saying child sexual abuse lawsuits. He's just trying to soften up his audience. He's just trying to manipulate his audience into thinking that when they read something in the newspapers or watch something on the news about Jehovah's Witnesses being involved in child abuse litigation, or settling a child abuse lawsuit, or a Jehovah's Witness being convicted of child sex abuse, they're supposed to think of it as not being such a big deal. That's what this is all about. Again, I'm doing what David Splain can't be bothered to do or doesn't want to do. I'm telling it like it is. This is what he's talking about. And how shameful. What has this organization become? We're at the point where Jehovah's Witness leaders are basically demeaning the entire concept of criminality. That's what this is about. And he can try and work in that stuff about political neutrality and the brothers in Korea. What was it he said?
Or suppose that someone is convicted and put in jail. Well, that would apply to our young brothers in Korea, wouldn't it? They were convicted and jailed. And what was their crime? They refused to kill someone.
He's literally trying to draw a comparison between young Jehovah's Witness men jailed in Korea for conscientious objection and people being jailed over child abuse. Obviously, they are completely different things, But we can see where he's going with this. Again, he's manipulating his audience with the basic argument of we can't trust the courts, we can't trust the judicial system, we should view with suspicion whenever Jehovah's Witnesses are arrested for anything. That's his basic argument, to the point where he goes on to say,
did they do anything wrong? Or someone is found guilty by men, as Jesus was. It doesn't mean that he's guilty in the sight of God.
So it doesn't matter, apparently, if someone's a convicted criminal, convicted by a court of law of doing a crime, of committing, of perpetrating a heinous act against another human being. It doesn't matter if a court of law has found a person guilty of committing crime. What matters is what God thinks. And I think we can all see what's happening here. I think David Splain is trying to preempt not just reports where Jehovah's Witness elders perhaps are jailed over child abuse. I think he's laying the groundwork for his own arrest, for the arrest of the governing body at some future point, because what they are doing is criminal, at least as far as I'm concerned. I don't know where the law stands on the industrial scale cover-up of child abuse on a database with thousands of names of predators that isn't being handed over to the police. But if that's not criminal now, it sure as hell will be in the future. And so it's conceivable that in our lifetime, David Splain and his colleagues will end up behind bars. I think that that's what should happen now. I think that's how serious this is. And I think David Splain is insecure about this prospect. So he's conditioning the Jehovah's Witness audience with an argument, with a pre-made argument of pay no mind to this. Just because you're seeing Tony Morris, David Splain, Stephen Lett behind bars with the rest of them doesn't mean they actually did something wrong. What matters is how God sees things. And when you get to that point with a religion, when you get to the point where religious leaders are making excuses for crime, are suggesting that crime isn't really such a big deal, and we should pay no mind under certain circumstances if someone is criminally convicted, you know you need to get out. And I'm speaking now to Jehovah's Witnesses who might be watching this. Come on, how do you defend this? How do you defend a religion that is now basically making it okay to commit crime under certain circumstances? This footage will age like milk. It will follow David Splain around to his dying breath. I'm certainly going to do everything I can to make sure it follows him around to his dying breath. You can be sure that what we've just seen now, this clip that we've just been examining, will be played again and again and again in documentaries that are dealing with Jehovah's Witnesses and the wide-scale cover-up of child sexual abuse, because it displays openly, at a glance, the contempt this organization has for the well-being of others, the contempt the leaders have for the very concept of being held accountable by law. And one more thing before we move on. I hope you caught the part where there was this Freudian slip by David Splain where he says,
so it's unlikely that the whole truth will ever come out in court. Actually, neither side probably wants the whole truth to come out in court.
Actually, neither side probably wants the whole truth to come out in court. Isn't that interesting? Neither side. Again, we're talking, I know he doesn't make this clear because he's trying to trick people. He's trying to deliberately muddy the waters and make this as vague as possible. But we're talking here about child sexual abuse litigation. We're talking about lawsuits surrounding the abuse of children and how that abuse has been handled or mishandled. Lawsuits that this organization that David Splain represents or leads is routinely getting caught up in. And here he's basically admitting neither side wants the truth to come out, meaning we don't want the truth to come out either.
I'll tell you an actual experience. Some time ago, a lawyer told me about a case he had. That was a case of medical malpractice by a doctor. There was a jury, and at trial, the doctor was clearly shown to be in the wrong, but the jury didn't give the patient a penny. The lawyer was confused, so after the trial, he approached two of the jurors and asked, "If you don't mind, tell me which part of the testimony you didn't believe." The jurors replied, "Oh, we didn't get that far. The doctor was cute, and we didn't want him to have to pay anything." With deep thinkers like that, no wonder many lawyers try to settle their cases rather than bring them to a jury. But someone will say, "No, I don't believe in settling out of court. I believe in justice and truth." So that brings up the question, is it wrong to settle a matter before it goes to trial? Or is it scriptural? Let's let Jesus answer that question. Turn to Matthew chapter 5, verses 25 and 26. Interesting that Jesus should mention this, with all the important things that Jesus taught. Matthew chapter 5, verses 25 and 26. Be quick to settle matters with your legal opponent while you are with him on the way there, so that somehow the opponent may not turn you over to the judge, and the judge to the court attendant, and you get thrown into prison. I say to you for a fact, you will certainly not come out of there until you have paid over your last small coin. Now, this is interesting. Think about the Mosaic Law. Was there any provision in the Mosaic Law to throw someone in jail if he couldn't pay a debt? That wasn't the way. If he couldn't pay, he'd have to work it off, or a family member would have to work it off. So when Jesus talks about prison and a judge, he's obviously referring to what a Gentile judge would do. Now, you couldn't necessarily expect justice from him. Why might he rule against our brother? Well, maybe he got paid under the table by the other party. Or maybe he was prejudiced against the race or the religion of the other party. Now notice, Jesus didn't say that the man should settle only if he was guilty. So brothers, let's not be naive. Don't believe everything you read. Just because an article is called a news report doesn't make it true. And an editorial is someone's opinion, and that someone may be wrong. And TV producers may have their own agenda, prejudice, and viewpoint.
Of course, David Splain doesn't have his own agenda, prejudice, and viewpoint. David Splain is totally unbiased in all of this. As one of the leaders of an organization that is routinely having to fend off litigation over child abuse lawsuits. And isn't it interesting? He's still saying nothing at all about child abuse. He's still failing to dignify his audience by making everything so vague and non-specific. All he's really doing here is, again, demeaning the entire concept of a court of law, of trying a civil or criminal lawsuit. And second of all, he's quite clearly trying to coerce Jehovah's Witnesses into thinking that there's nothing untoward whatsoever when it comes to settling cases out of court, which, again, the organization is doing in case after case after case. David Splain apparently digging out a verse that excuses this, and then going on to say, of course, just because we settle doesn't mean we're guilty.
Now notice, Jesus didn't say that the man should settle only if he was guilty.
Why would you settle if you're innocent? If you are the innocent party, and you are God's one and only true organization on earth, with a reputation to protect, and you're on the receiving end of litigation that is unfair and unjust, and you have dedicated funds to be thinking about, money that's been donated for the purpose of furthering the good news, Caleb and Sophia's ice cream money we're talking about here, you need to spend this wisely, and someone tries suing the organisation unfairly, it would be wrong to settle. Of course you should fight. Of course you should try and get justice and get the case thrown out or overcome or prevail in some way so that you don't have to give over a single penny of dedicated funds, or you pay the bare minimum. Settling, of course, implies guilt. You're only going to settle, you're only going to throw money, potentially millions, at a child abuse survivor if they have a point, if they have a case against the organisation. And that's what we've been seeing in case after case. I won't go into them all here. There's plenty of material like that if you do the digging online, either on JW Watch or on the Lloyd Evans channel whenever we've done Watchtower in Focus or JW Watch episodes. Heck, the media, just type in Jehovah's Witnesses child abuse cases, child abuse lawsuits, and see what comes up, and you will see that time and time again, this is an organisation that tries to get cases buried the minute it becomes obvious that they are going to lose. And the reason that they're going to lose is not because the jury is biased, not because there's some inherent flaw in the legal system. It's because this is an organisation that is failing children and they are being found out.
So, what do we say in revision? In conclusion, our faith is under attack, and we have to fight. And Jehovah gives us what we need to fight with. One of the things he gives us, good associations. Satan will try to lure us away from good associations. He'll try to weaken our faith by getting us involved in bad association without our knowing it. But Jehovah provides good association in the congregation. These are people we know. These are people we love. These are people who have our best interests at heart. Keep in mind the principle we find at Proverbs 13 and verse 20. The one walking with the wise will become wise, but the one who has dealings with the stupid will fare badly. You know the members of your congregation. You know that they are wise. You know that they have your best interests at heart. But if you get involved in a forum, you might not know whether you're walking with wise persons or not, at least not at first. So be careful. If the conversation turns negative, get out. Satan is behind the twisted teachings of apostates. He's the father of the lie. And those who lie are doing exactly what their father does. The apostates have nothing to offer us, brothers. All they have to offer is hate. All they have is, to offer is criticism and negative talk. But oh, how upbuilt we feel when we're with those who love Jehovah. So Jehovah provides us with good, wholesome associations. He also provides us with his word of truth, and an accurate knowledge of the truth is the best defense against apostasy. Read the Bible every day and meditate on it. Pay attention to the words. Pay attention to what they mean. Be like the Bereans, referred to at Acts chapter 17.
I'm glad he mentioned the Bereans, and we will revisit his reasoning regarding the Bereans, which I agree with, by the way, but I do just need to interject because we've heard an awful lot there. We're obviously in David Splain's concluding talk on the Saturday, Put Up a Hard Fight for the Faith, a 34-minute rant against apostates and the media, and I hope you noticed the patronising, scornful, condescending way that David Splain is talking down to his audience.
So be careful. If the conversation turns negative, get out.
We're at the point where a governing body member is literally barking orders at his followers. This man is clearly rattled, clearly disturbed, clearly desperate, to the point where he's just yapping. He's just barking orders, get out, don't have anything to do with it, ignore them, be careful, if you go against what I'm telling you here, you will pay. That's the nature now of the Jehovah's Witness religion. That's the climate of fear and control that this organization has descended into. I also find it fascinating where he talks about good association.
But Jehovah provides good association in the congregation. These are people we know. These are people we love. These are people who have our best interests at heart.
When it comes to the industrial scale cover-up of child sexual abuse, to the point where this organization is keeping a database with thousands of names on it that aren't being passed on to law enforcement, isn't it precisely the point that Jehovah's Witnesses don't know who's in their congregation? They don't know who they can trust. They don't know who is or isn't a sex offender, because that information is being kept from them on a secret database, which we can prove because of documented policies, as I've gone into before. In fact, if Tibor is gracious, here's just one video where I summarize all the reasons why we know that there is a database of child abusers being kept by the organization. So how can Jehovah's Witnesses know who's good and who's bad? And as for these are people we love, well, it's love that's paper thin, isn't it? It's love that evaporates the moment you do something slightly untoward, according to the expectations of the organization. Even just having doubts, even just missing the odd meeting, even not being so regular on the ministry, you will start to be shunned as bad association. That's the love that never fails, that David Splain is apparently so proud of. And as for this dig about apostates having nothing to offer, David Splain has the gall to say,
The apostates have nothing to offer us, brothers. All they have to offer is hate. All they have is, to offer is criticism and negative talk.
Interestingly, I made a video on this only a month ago. If Tibor is gracious, a thumbnail will appear. What can apostates offer? And I made the point in that video that we can actually offer quite a lot. We can offer freedom of mind, the ability to think for yourself, the freedom to not have scam artists and charlatans like this David Splain lecturing you on what information you can or can't consider. The freedom to be in control of your life. This is control that David Splain insists on having. The governing body insists on micromanaging the lives of Jehovah's Witnesses, on doing their thinking for them, on making their decisions for them, even in areas as intimate as what medicine you should accept. Apostates, on the other hand, people like myself, are saying, you know what, you decide that stuff. You're a grown-up, you can figure this out for yourself. You do not need an organization to run your life for you. That's what apostates are offering, the freedom to think for yourself. I think on some level David Splain knows this, but he is terrified of losing control, and this fear, this desperation has been palpable throughout his talk.
Be like the Bereans, referred to in Acts chapter 17 and verses 10 and 11. Let's read that. Acts chapter 17, verses 10 and 11. Immediately by night, the brothers sent both Paul and Silas to Berea. On arriving, they went into the synagogue of the Jews. Now these were more noble-minded than those in Thessalonica, for they accepted the word with the greatest eagerness of mind, carefully examining the Scriptures daily, to see whether these things were so. Now Paul compares the Bereans with the Thessalonians. What do we know about the Thessalonians? Well, they didn't have YouTube in those days. But at one point, the Thessalonians apparently heard a rumor that the day of Jehovah had arrived. Who circulated the rumor? An apostate? Maybe. But maybe it was just someone who had heard the rumor and passed it on without checking it out. Have you ever done that? Passed on a report without checking the facts? I think all of us have to admit that we've been guilty of that at one time or another. But now, how did the Thessalonians react? They were alarmed. They were quickly shaken from their reason. We mustn't let that happen to us. When you hear something, check it out. Don't just circulate it. Don't just believe it. Check it out. Colossians 2, 6, and 7, the last scripture we'll read during this talk. And here Paul explains how we can avoid being quickly shaken from our reason. Let's read this final scripture. Colossians chapter 2, verses 6 and 7. Therefore, just as you have accepted Christ Jesus the Lord, go on walking in union with him. You do that and you'll be walking with a wise one, certainly. Being rooted and built up in him, and then notice this, and being stabilized in the faith, just as you were taught. If we're stabilized in the faith, we won't be quickly shaken by unfounded accusations by apostates or the media. False rumors are often spread during wartime. Brothers, this is war. We need to put up a hard fight for the faith, as if our life depended on it. Because it does.
Wow. So David Splain's 34-minute rant against apostates and the media ends in fitting fashion with an existential threat against the lives of Jehovah's Witnesses if they don't heed his warning. Do as I'm telling you, ignore those pesky apostates, don't listen to anything they have to say, pretend that everything's fine, ignore the man behind the curtain, and if you don't do as I'm telling you, you're gonna die. Wow, such a warm, loving organization this, isn't it? We've literally reached the point where, apart from making excuses for crime, apart from demeaning the entire process of trial by jury, of criminal convictions, David Splain is here just flat out issuing threats, because that's what narcissistic cult leaders do. That's all he has left. He hasn't given us any compelling arguments. He hasn't given us examples to look out for of how apostates are lying. All he's given us is blatant manipulation and fear-mongering that very blatantly shows that this organization is on the ropes. Imagine what conversations must have been going on behind closed doors for this talk to even be considered necessary, let alone delivered in such a condescending, patronizing, and ultimately threatening way. And I mentioned earlier about actually agreeing with David Splain when it comes to pointing to the Bereans. He reads the verse there in Acts chapter 17, verses 10 and 11, which is encouraging people, if you think about it, encouraging people to figure things out for themselves. That's what the Bereans were doing. They were carefully examining the scriptures daily to see whether these things were so. Are these things so? Are these arguments that the apostates are making valid? Do these criticisms check out? Do they stand up to scrutiny? If the Bereans were confronted with apostate claims, they would have done the investigating. They would have done the research. They would have fact-checked what the apostates were saying to find out whether these things were so. And it's interesting that David Splain reads this verse and kind of ties himself in knots a little bit, because he's just spent the whole talk telling Jehovah's Witnesses to not even listen to apostate arguments. And after reading this scripture in Acts, he can't help but backpedal a little bit to the point where he's effectively saying, you need to check these things out.
Don't try to argue with the apostates. Don't read their comments. When you hear something, check it out. Don't just circulate it. Don't just believe it. Check it out.
Which is it, David Splain? Make your mind up. Are we supposed to bury our heads in the sand? Are we supposed to not listen to what apostates are saying? Or are we supposed to check it out? Again, I think he's just completely tied himself in knots, just assuming the verses that he's chosen for his talk are going to support his argument, and not realizing that most of what he's been saying completely contradicts the verse there in Acts, which is saying, if you hear something, don't just take it at face value, check it out. How are you going to check it out if you don't look at what the claims are and fact check them? I also love the little dig at YouTube. David Splain says,
Now, Paul compares the Bereans with the Thessalonians. What do we know about the Thessalonians? Well, they didn't have YouTube in those days. But at one point, the Thessalonians apparently heard a rumor that the day of Jehovah had arrived.
yes, he can't help but mention YouTube. Actually, I would have liked him to be more explicit when it comes to YouTube. As I'm going to mention, I think overall, this talk is a positive for my side, for apostates. Could have been even more of a positive if he'd flat out said, stay off YouTube. YouTube is from the devil. It's full of apostates. If you're one of Jehovah's Witnesses, you absolutely shouldn't be going on YouTube. I think when the organization finally says that, that's really the point of no return. They will basically be throwing their hands up and saying, you win at that point. When they get that desperate as to ban YouTube, that's when we know we really have them. But this talk, make no mistake, is a turning point. As I said before, it will age very, very poorly. Clips of this talk will be played long into the future to show people just how controlling and manipulative and fear-mongering this organization is. What David Splain has done here is effectively make my argument for me and just provide a glowing example of what this organization is all about. Again, we've reached the point where Jehovah's Witnesses are an organization that makes excuses for criminality, that makes excuses for criminal convictions. What does that say of the leaders? When you have a leadership that's saying, in some cases, it's no big deal if there's a criminal conviction, you need to get the hell out of there. And I am glad he's done this. I am glad that David Splain has given this talk. As grotesque as it was, as enraging as it was to see my side, to see apostates misrepresented with all of these generalizations and insults, as frustrating as all of that was, he wouldn't have been doing that if the governing body weren't losing. And make no mistake, the governing body are losing this war that they're now telling Jehovah's Witnesses they need to fight.
Brothers, this is war. We need to put up a hard fight for the faith, as if our life depended on it. Because it does.
David Splain can call this a war if he likes, if that's going to work for him, if that's going to help him mobilize his army, if that's going to strengthen the faith of Jehovah's Witnesses. But make no mistake, this is a war they are losing. All of the information is out there now, online, on YouTube. There's nowhere to hide for snake oil salesmen like David Splain and his pals. Their lies and manipulations are on full display for everyone to see, and that's why they are so desperate. And when you are desperate, by the way, you make mistakes. And from their point of view, this talk has been one big mistake, because all they've done is open up a huge can of worms. In this talk, they recognized that apostates are more of a problem in some parts of the world than in others. And what is he doing by devoting a 34-minute talk on apostates for all Jehovah's Witnesses to watch? Irrespective of what part of the world they're from, he's making apostasy a problem even for Jehovah's Witnesses who've so far been completely sheltered from it, so that many of these will now be curious and will want to know what the hell's going on. Even if you've had dealings with apostates before, if you're watching this as one of Jehovah's Witnesses, how can you not be curious to know what's causing all of this? How can you not want to know what these claims are that are so misleading? If they really are so misleading, shouldn't it be obvious at first glance that they're misleading? David Splain doesn't seem to understand how reverse psychology works. The more he jumps up and down and tells Jehovah's Witnesses, whatever you do, don't look at the man behind the curtain, the more they're going to want to look at the man behind the curtain. And this is why I enjoy having opponents. We're speaking about this as being a war. I enjoy having opponents when I am in a war who are deluded. Because when your opponent is deluded, they make mistakes. And this talk has been a 34-minute mistake. Not just a mistake, a train wreck. They will live to regret giving this talk or allowing David Splain to give this talk. As we mentioned on the live stream where we discussed this, David Splain has just given his legal team a huge amount of work to do, because these words will come back to haunt this organization at every turn, particularly the contempt they have for holding criminals to account and bringing them to justice. So, by the end of David Splain's 34-minute rant against apostates and the media, you'd be forgiven for thinking that that was everything that needed to be said on this subject. But you'd be wrong. The next morning, governing body helper Leonard Myers gave a talk titled "Imitate Women of Strong Faith, the Phoenician Woman," in which the subject of apostasy was revisited.
In the following dramatization, note how someone who has just started to have a good relationship with God might need to display strong faith like that of the Phoenician woman.
I never thought it would happen. I finally found what I'd been searching for. A good relationship with God. Then one day, a coworker texted an article that claimed to expose Jehovah's Witnesses. I was tempted to read it. And then I thought back to when I first met Jehovah's Witnesses. I was so excited about what they taught me from the Bible. That God's name is Jehovah, the kingdom is a real government, and so much more. Why would I want to learn about Jehovah's Witnesses from their enemies? But my friends, not so much. I saw people who really love one another. It's a real brotherhood. But it wasn't just the people. This was the truth. I didn't need to learn about Jehovah's Witnesses from their enemies. I had seen for myself that they worshiped the true God, Jehovah.
Did you notice how the young man recognized and put faith in Jehovah's organization? That was a protection, so he wasn't misled by lies from our enemies.
So we're watching Leonard Myers in his talk, Imitate Women of Strong Faith, the Phoenician Woman. And isn't this just a continuation of David Splain's apostate bashing talk from the Saturday afternoon? I mean, the message is exactly the same. Jehovah's Witnesses here being told to bury their heads in the sand if they encounter anything at all that's critical of their religion. In this case, the dramatization features someone who's studying to become a Jehovah's Witness. And isn't it interesting, before we even get into the whole apostasy thing, isn't it interesting the change in his appearance between when they meet him and when he's giving us this monologue? He starts off with dreadlocks, and by the time he's giving this monologue, he's minus the dreadlocks. He's had to conform his appearance to Jehovah's Witness expectations, even if that means denuding him of an expression of his culture. I think that's very telling. This, for me, should be an issue of concern for anyone who's thinking about studying with Jehovah's Witnesses. If this is the level to which they micromanage you, if they're literally expecting black men to shave off their dreadlocks, what does that tell you about how controlling this group is? And this is in a video that's supposed to be accusing people like me of lying, of exaggerating about Jehovah's Witnesses. I don't need to lie, Leonard Myers. I don't need to exaggerate. You're doing my work for me. You're literally depicting a black man having to shave off his dreadlocks to conform to Jehovah's Witness expectations. And then we get these terrible arguments for ignoring criticism of Jehovah's Witnesses that don't make any sense at all.
I was so excited about what they taught me from the Bible. That God's name is Jehovah, the kingdom is a real government, and so much more. Why would I want to learn about Jehovah's Witnesses from their enemies?
Why would I want to learn about a school I'm considering enrolling my child in from people who've had children go to that school? Of course, if you're considering joining a religion, you're going to want to hear the good, the bad, the ugly from people who've been in that religion, not just those who are still in it and are obviously going to have good things to say about it, but people who've left. Why would you exclude their testimony? If you're going to get a rounded picture of what a religion is like, why would you only listen to one side of the argument? And quite frankly, I found the whole wording of that question quite a straw man, because the question was, why would I want to learn about Jehovah's Witnesses from their enemies? I don't consider Jehovah's Witnesses to be my enemies. And I'm arguably one of the most well-known sources of videos that criticize Jehovah's Witnesses. I don't consider them my enemies. I take exception to the leadership of Jehovah's Witnesses lying to and manipulating Jehovah's Witnesses, because I think for the most part, Jehovah's Witnesses are kind, loving people who don't deserve to be lied to and don't deserve to be manipulated. And that's why I make this information available. My criticism is against the leadership of Jehovah's Witnesses, the governing body, not against Jehovah's Witnesses as individuals, as a people. So it's really a straw man criticism, a straw man argument that's being presented here. And you only construct a straw man argument if your position is weak, so that you need to misrepresent the other side. It's a tool of manipulation. When you need to exaggerate the opposing side to your argument, you are trying to mislead, you are trying to manipulate. And I love the part where he lists all the many things he's learning about God and the Bible. I was so excited about what they taught me from the Bible, that God's name is Jehovah, the kingdom is a real government, and so much more. Yeah, wow, what an extensive list. You've learned that God's name is Jehovah, which it isn't. It's actually Yahweh, if we want to be precise. And you've learned that the kingdom is a government. And that's apparently enough for you to ignore any criticism whatsoever against a religion that you're joining, a religion that wants to control you, and in fact has already persuaded you to alter your appearance by shaving off your dreadlocks. He also says,
I saw people who really love one another. It's a real brotherhood. But it wasn't just the people. This was the truth.
yeah, if it were a cult, you wouldn't be able to say that, would you? You wouldn't be seeing a group of followers who all love one another. You wouldn't be seeing a brotherhood where people from the same group look out for each other and do nice things to each other and love bomb each other. That's not the sort of thing cults do, is it? Except it obviously is. Look, I can't help but see this dramatization as yet another own goal. It's a good example, in my view, of the Streisand effect. The Wikipedia article on the Streisand effect describes it this way. The Streisand effect is a social phenomenon that occurs when an attempt to hide, remove, or censor information has the unintended consequence of further publicizing that information, often via the internet. Because the organization are so deluded, because they don't apparently know, because they are so inept when it comes to basic human psychology, they just cannot help but showing how desperate they are. And the more they tell Jehovah's Witnesses, don't look behind the curtain, it's basic human psychology that Jehovah's Witnesses are going to want to look behind the curtain, especially if they had doubts to begin with. And I obviously can't prove it, but I would guess that probably the majority of Jehovah's Witnesses have doubts at some level. And if you're repeatedly being told, both overtly in talks by David Splain, for example, and through dramatizations, don't look at the apostate material, don't look at the apostate material, you're going to sort of be tempted to see what all of the fuss is about. And especially if you're not being given an actual reason why it's, quote, poison, if the organization can give no firm examples of exactly why apostate material is lying, is misleading, is poison, what other conclusion can you reasonably come to than that the apostates might be onto something? If you're going to insist, if you're going to bark orders at someone and say, don't do this, and if you're going to do that repeatedly with any kind of success, it really behooves you to sit down with that person and explain exactly why it is that you're doing this. If you're barking these orders and there's no obvious reason why the person shouldn't do that thing, it's only human nature that the person, while your back is turned, is going to think, I'm going to see what's so bad about this thing that I'm repeatedly being told not to do without any explanation at all or any logical explanation of why I shouldn't do it. So I, for one, am grateful that the organization is quite clearly reeling from the efforts of apostates and possibly from media exposure and lawsuits, etc., to the point where they are desperate enough to make these mistakes. It's encouraging. And it will be very interesting to see what long-term effect this paranoia and scaremongering has on individual witnesses. Don't be surprised if in the coming years we hear of people waking up and coming out of the religion precisely because of the sort of material we've just seen.
Like that woman, we need to recognize Jehovah's representatives and associate with them. At Matthew 24:45, Jesus identified these representatives. He foretold that in our day he would use the faithful and discreet slave to provide spiritual food at the proper time. Why can we have strong faith that the governing body is filling that role of the faithful and discreet slave? Consider 3 lines of evidence. First, there's evidence of Holy Spirit guiding these brothers. For example, Holy Spirit has helped the governing body to grasp scriptural truths not previously understood. These brothers feel as the Apostle Paul, who wrote at 1 Corinthians 2:13, "These things we also speak, not with words taught by human wisdom, but with those taught by the Spirit." Second, we see evidence of angelic assistance. The governing body has the immense task of overseeing an international preaching work involving over 8 million evangelizers. The overall growth of the preaching and disciple-making work, despite fierce opposition in some lands, has been possible only with superhuman assistance. A third line of evidence is reliance on God's Word. Some religions may revise teachings in order to appease beliefs and opinions of their members. But our dear brothers of the governing body allow their decisions to be guided by God's Word rather than popular opinion. We can have strong faith that Jehovah, through His Son, is directing the governing body. And we need to remain loyal to these faithful brothers and to Jehovah's organization, despite attempts by opposers to discredit them. What will be the outcome if we do? Think back to the example of the Phoenician woman. Was she rewarded for her strong faith? Yes, when her beloved daughter was healed. Likewise, if you display strong faith and follow the direction of our leader Jesus, He will lead you to everlasting life.
We've just heard from Leonard Myers in his talk, Imitate Women of Strong Faith, the Phoenician Woman, 3 reasons to obey and follow the governing body. And they're all terrible reasons. So we have essentially, and we'll go through them one by one, but here is my summary of what the reasons are. Reason number 1, the governing body gets new light. Reason number 2, we're big. And reason number 3, the governing body isn't afraid to be unpopular. Those are essentially the reasons that are being put to Jehovah's Witnesses. Again, all terrible reasons. Let's go through them in a bit more detail because I don't want to be accused of misrepresenting these arguments or these lines of evidence. So let's take line of evidence number 1.
First, there's evidence of Holy Spirit guiding these brothers. For example, Holy Spirit has helped the governing body to grasp scriptural truths not previously understood.
Again, this argument is essentially we get new light. We periodically change our teachings. We change our minds on what certain Bible verses mean, and we change our doctrine accordingly. There's nothing unique about a religion that does that, but even if we were to take this seriously as a line of evidence, what's the track record? What is the evidence? I recently did a video on New Light, thumbnail here, if Tibor is gracious, which summarizes how flawed this whole concept is. Essentially, the whole concept of New Light accuses God of lying, because either God is guiding the organization through His Holy Spirit and always has been since 1919, or that's not the case. If God is really guiding the organization, why would He guide the organization to teach something that's not true and later change His mind and guide them to teach something different? This flies in the face of the notion of a God who cannot lie. The New Light teaching essentially blames God for wrong teachings that the organization once promulgated. But we have in recent memory examples, clear examples of just how flawed this new light has been. You can watch the 2019 annual meeting in which David Splain, as good as admits that it was only in that year or the year before that all of a sudden they were able to read the book of Joel in context and realize that the locusts mentioned in the book of Joel were not the same as the locusts mentioned in the book of Revelation, which is what they had previously been teaching. All of a sudden, the governing body had received the power to read the Bible in context. Really. We're supposed to be impressed by that. And again, if you're one of Jehovah's Witnesses and you don't know what I'm talking about, please check out the New Light video because I explain it all in more detail. That was the 2019 annual meeting. Only a year later, in the 2020 annual meeting, bear in mind, the annual meeting events are the events where you expect new light. You expect, how did they put it, Holy Spirit helping the governing body to grasp scriptural truths not previously understood. It's at these events where you expect these new scriptural truths to be unveiled. And what did we see unveiled at the 2020 annual meeting by Kenneth Cook? We saw what amounted to a flip-flop. We saw the religion revert to an old teaching of Rutherford, namely that the sheep and the goats are being judged now in the present time rather than at some future time, either during the Great Tribulation or after the Great Tribulation, which had been the previous teaching, or more specifically, the teaching between Rutherford's teaching and the new light now. So again, if all of this is a bit confusing, I do explain it all in the new light video. But how can you be proud of this? How can you be proud of only recently learning how to read the Bible in context and coming up with new light that is essentially just recycling previous teachings that you've more recently deviated from? Even when you look at this line of evidence, what you find is that the whole process of coming up with scriptural truth is really nothing for the governing body to be proud of, and certainly not a reason to obey them. That was line of evidence number one. Line of evidence number two.
Second, we see evidence of angelic assistance. The governing body has the immense task of overseeing an international preaching work involving over 8 million evangelizers. The overall growth of the preaching and disciple-making work, despite fierce opposition in some lands, has been possible only with superhuman assistance.
Isn't it interesting how Leonard Myers is so careful and so precise with words? The overall growth of the preaching and disciple-making work. Notice he doesn't say the growth of Jehovah's Witnesses, and he can't say that because last year, 2020, the numbers fell for the first time in 42 years by 0.6%, despite all of the efforts of Jehovah's Witnesses, despite 1.7 billion hours worth of preaching, despite all of the new tools, JW Broadcasting, JW.org, the various publications that are available to Jehovah's Witnesses, this super-duper organization that's organizing the preaching work, and they shrank. They shrank by 0.6%. So they know they can't talk about the growth in numbers because actually the numbers went backwards last year. Instead, they have to talk about something more vague, more unfalsifiable, such as, oh, well, at least the preaching work is growing. Well, if you say so, Leonard Myers, I mean, how do we disprove that? But what really does this line of evidence amount to It amounts to pointing to the size of the organization as being evidence of angelic assistance. Only with angelic assistance could you have a religion with over 8 million followers that is organized. Even though you're all already thinking of any number of other religions of similar or greater size that have a hierarchy and have some level of organization. They may have totally different teachings to Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah's Witnesses may view them as Babylon the Great, and you're doing it wrong and you're doomed. Ours is the only truth. But how can you point to your size as being evidence? If it's all about size, if it's all about how many members you have and how worldwide your religion is, aren't there any number of other religious organizations that get to claim that they are getting angelic assistance, because only with angelic assistance can you keep a large global religion together? That was line of evidence number 2. Again, terrible evidence, literally just an appeal to the size of the organization. And then we have line of evidence number 3.
A third line of evidence is reliance on God's Word. Some religions may revise teachings in order to appease beliefs and opinions of their members. But our dear brothers of the governing body allow their decisions to be guided by God's Word rather than popular opinion.
Again, this amounts to simply saying, look, the governing body aren't afraid to be unpopular. The governing body are not afraid to be jerks. Look at how willing they are to stick to harmful beliefs, harmful policies, including policies that put children in danger. Other religions wouldn't do that. Other religions would cave in to popular opinion and shock horror, make sure children are protected. But because it's the faithful slave and they're being led by God, they're not afraid to ruffle a few feathers. They're not afraid to be unpopular. And this is a line of evidence. This is a reason to follow them. These are all, again, terrible reasons that don't stand up to any kind of careful thought or scrutiny. But these are the sorts of bad reasons that Jehovah's Witnesses are to swallow. It turns out that just as with any man-made religion, when it comes to finding reasons to stay loyal to the leaders, facts and evidence and logic and reason just goes out of the window, and it all just boils down to faith. So by now the message was coming through loud and clear. If you're one of Jehovah's Witnesses, you need to bury your head in the sand and ignore anything that apostates have to say. Remembering, of course, that the governing body are unquestionably God's channel of communication with mankind, so there's no reason for any doubt or uncertainty. But it turned out there was still more to say about apostates, and it would be said by governing body member Stephen Lett in his concluding talk of the convention, "Become powerful by your faith."
The talk put up a hard fight for the faith, reminded us that, as is true in all fights, in our fight, we have enemies. For one thing, we must reject apostate lies and the false stories of other opposers, which are designed to sow doubt and weaken faith. Satan is very skilled at using innuendo, half-truths, and lies. So it's not surprising that the news media, which is often manipulated by apostates, clergymen, and other opposers, likewise often employs innuendo, half-truths, and lies against Jehovah's organization. Think about this. Faith is a product of Holy Spirit. It's a provision from Jehovah to strengthen us, whereas doubt is a tool of the devil designed to weaken us. Do you recall how Satan approached Eve? Is it really so that God said you must not eat from every tree of the garden? Is that really so? Why did he present it that way? To plant doubt and shipwreck her faith. And he succeeded. Well, likewise, if we're not careful, doubt can shipwreck our faith. But strong faith keeps doubt out of our hearts and minds.
So here we're being treated to a 3.5-minute reprise of David Splain's 34-minute apostate rant from the Saturday afternoon of the convention. Stephen Lett wants in on the action. He's adding his own 2 cents, and in so doing, he just cannot help but show how culty this organization is.
Faith is a product of Holy Spirit. It's a provision from Jehovah to strengthen us, whereas doubt is a tool of the devil designed to weaken us.
Yes, if you happen to be a Jehovah's Witness with doubts, how dare you? You need to get rid of those doubts, because doubt is a tool of the devil designed to weaken you. If you harbor doubts, you are letting Satan weaken you. You need to instead just believe everything. Just believe everything, so long as it comes from the governing body. You're not allowed to believe anything you hear that's critical of Jehovah's Witnesses. And isn't that the gist? Isn't that the entire message, both of what Stephen Lett's saying here and of David Splain's talk? You're only allowed to trust us. You have to automatically dismiss as lies anything that's critical of the organization. And just as David Splain refused to give a single example of what these lies are, so that Jehovah's Witnesses can reach their own conclusions as to whether they actually are lies or not, Stephen Lett's following the same playbook. He's refusing to give a single example, and this is an insult. This is insulting the intelligence of his audience. If he really respected his audience, if he really esteemed his audience and dignified them with the ability to figure things out for themselves, he would give us at least one example of an apostate lie, any example, and he would demonstrate how it's a lie. But he's not going to do that, is he? Because it turns out that apostates are right, and both Stephen Lett and David Splain know this. They know that if Jehovah's Witnesses look behind the curtain, once they've realized that they're being lied to and manipulated, this will result in shipwreck.
If we're not careful, doubt can shipwreck our faith.
If you're in the wrong faith, if your faith is wrong, if your religion is false, maybe your faith needs to be shipwrecked. Maybe it needs to be destroyed so that you can start anew, so that you can find out what the truth is. Why should you continue believing lies just for the sake of it? And how can you find out whether it's really the truth or not, whether you're being lied to, if you follow Stephen Lett and David Splain's advice and never listen to any criticism of your beliefs?
But now, talking just a little bit more about apostates, what if an apostate knocked at your front door and said, "I'd like to come into your home, I'd like to sit down with you, and I'd like to teach you some apostate ideas"? Well, you would immediately get rid of him, wouldn't you? You would send him down the highway. But now think of this. What if that same apostate tries to come into your home by means of the television or computer? Well, hopefully, we reject him just as decisively. 2 John 10 says, "If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, never receive him into your home." That would mean not through the front door, not through the television or computer. Sadly, though, some have reasoned, foolishly, if I listen to this apostate on television or the computer, or perhaps read his book, I'll recognize how wrong he is. It'll build up my faith. And if I ever encounter this teaching in the ministry, I'll better be able to refute it. Well, that is foolish thinking indeed. That would be like reasoning, if I eat stinky, rotten food from a garbage can, it'll really help me in the future to recognize bad food. Not very good reasoning, is it? Rather than feed our minds poison apostate ideas, we read God's Word daily and strengthen and safeguard our faith.
Yes, apparently if you encounter an apostate, you need to send him down the highway.
Well, you would immediately get rid of him, wouldn't you? You would send him down the highway.
Oh no, not the highway. The highway of shame. I'm being sent away because I'm an apostate and no one should listen to my ideas. This man is terrified, isn't he? You can smell the desperation on Stephen Lett just as you could with David Splain. These guys have been rumbled, haven't they? They are terrified that this house of cards is falling down. This elaborate illusion is so easily being untangled by anyone going online and listening to what apostates have to say. It's interesting that Stephen Lett identifies television, videos, and books, was it?
Sadly, though, some have reasoned, foolishly, if I listen to this apostate on television or the computer, or perhaps read his book, I'll recognize how wrong he is. It'll build up my faith.
I'm going to be honest, part of me really wants him to be talking about me because I obviously have videos that you can play on the computer and I have a book that Jehovah's Witnesses aren't allowed to read. But what he's referring to, obviously, is the win-win scenario that I often refer to on my channel. If you're a Jehovah's Witness and you're confronted with information that's critical of your beliefs, it's a win-win scenario for you to look at these criticisms because either you will realize that these criticisms aren't valid, that the arguments are flawed, and that therefore your faith is valid and your faith will be stronger than ever, or you'll learn that the criticisms are valid, that the arguments against your faith are fair and reasonable, and you'll have the ability to do something about it. You'll have the freedom to leave this false religion behind. And Stephen Lett's best answer to this win-win scenario is, yes, but it's rotten food. And you wouldn't want to eat rotten food, would you?
Well, that is foolish thinking indeed. That would be like reasoning, if I eat stinky, rotten food from a garbage can, it'll really help me in the future to recognize bad food. Not very good reasoning, is it?
As stupid as this is, I actually prefer this to David Splain's answer, because David Splain's answer was to say, well, you wouldn't drink poison, would you? And obviously with poison, the thing about poison is that you can't necessarily tell what is or isn't poison. I mean, obviously, if it has on the bottle poison, you know it's poison. But typically when someone's trying to poison you, they will put it in your drink or put it in your food, and it will be hard to know for sure whether it's poison or not. By using this analogy, Stephen Lett is comparing apostate information to something where you can easily identify whether it's harmful or detrimental or not. Because if food really is stinky and rotten and from a garbage can, you'll be able to decide this for yourself, won't you? There'll be some evidence to suggest that it's rotten. You know, the bad smell will be obvious. You'll be able to see that it's come from a garbage can. And yes, no one in their right mind, hopefully, would eat food like that. But you're basing this judgment on things that can be verified. You can verify the fact, usually, that the food is rotten. You can verify the fact that it's stinky, and you can verify the fact that it's come from a garbage can. By contrast, how are you supposed to verify that apostates are lying if you're not listening to their arguments? If you won't even entertain the basic premise of the apostate's argument, if you're putting your hands over your ears and saying, la, 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 I can't hear you, if you're burying your head in the sand and just refusing to know anything about what their argument actually is, how can you know whether it's rotten? How can you know whether it's stinky? How can you know that it isn't actually delicious, nutritious food for the purposes of this analogy? So what Stephen Lett's done, because he's a bit dim, is replace David Splain's analogy, where there's poison, which you can't test, with his own analogy, comparing apostate information to rotten food, thus weakening the analogy, because how are you supposed to tell whether food is rotten if you're unwilling to look at it? Quite honestly, as I said in my response to David Splain's talk, I am rubbing my hands at all of this ranting against apostates and against the media. Yes, it's frustrating to see my side insulted and subjected to all of this ad hominem and compared to rotten food and compared to poison. You know, they can throw all of these insults as far as I'm concerned, but for me it's delicious that they are desperate enough to do that, that they are so threatened by what apostates are saying and doing. The collective activism of the ex-Jehovah's Witness community is having such a huge impact on the organization that they're seeing, because they can see the numbers. It's delicious for me that all of this effort is causing them to be so paranoid and so visibly desperate. The more they jump up and down telling Jehovah's Witnesses, don't look behind the curtain, the more Jehovah's Witnesses are going to want to do precisely that. So that was all I wanted to share with you on the subject of apostasy from this year's convention. Needless to say, the organisation seems to be in damage control mode. And as I've already commented, their almost obsessive emphasis on crushing any and all criticism speaks to an air of desperation among the top brass as they see their cult slowly dwindle in the information age. Anyway, I hope you found this video interesting. Please don't forget to subscribe to the Lloyd Evans channel for more such videos. And as always, thank you for watching.